This is the tragic family behind Motown's $300 million black music empire, and their story is more heartbreaking than most people know. At the center of it all is Berry Gordy Jr., a man who built the most powerful black-owned music company in American history with just $800 borrowed from his own family. Presidents knew his name. The artists he signed became the biggest stars on the planet. For 3 decades, the Gordy family's influence over American music seemed untouchable. But behind every #1 record was a family quietly losing people it could never replace. And when Berry finally let the empire go, it left black hands forever. What happened to the Gordy family? This is the story Motown never told about itself. The family that came north. Born into a Georgia that still carried the weight of slavery in its soil, Berry Gordy Sr. arrived in the world in 1888 in Oconee, Washington County, a place where black families worked to generate wealth their ancestors had been forced to build and received almost nothing in return. He was the kind of man who looked at that reality and decided it was not permanent. He built a small store and established himself in the community, and that establishment eventually made him a target, because in the American South of the early 1900s, a successful black man with a growing reputation was often a man whose safety was at risk. When threats from local white residents made Georgia too dangerous to stay in, Berry Sr. made the decision that would change everything his family would ever become. He packed his wife Bertha and their children and moved north to Detroit in 1922, joining millions of other black Americans who were leaving the South during the period history would later call the Great Migration, all of them heading towards cities where factory work and something closer to safety was waiting. Detroit gave the Gordy family room to grow. Berry Sr. opened a plastering and carpentry business, ran a grocery store on the east side of the city, and helped co-found the Friendship Mutual Life Insurance Company alongside his wife Bertha. He also built a family of 8 children inside that Detroit house, named Fuller, Esther, Anna, Lucy, George, Gwendolyn, Berry Jr., and Robert. And he raised every one of them in a household where owning something and building something were not ideas but expectations. Berry Jr. was the 7th of those 8 children, born on November 28, 1929, entering the world right at the start of the Great Depression. He grew up watching his father run businesses, and his mother managed the family finances with a discipline that kept everything standing when the economy tried to knock it over. But Berry Jr. was restless in a way that did not fit the construction work and printing jobs his father assigned to the older boys. He dropped out of Northeastern High School in the 11th grade to pursue professional boxing, went 13 wins and 6 losses in the featherweight division, and then, in 1951, the United States Army drafted him into the Korean War before he could figure out where his life was headed. He came back from Korea in 1953 with a high school equivalency diploma and a head full of music. He married a woman named Thelma Coleman, borrowed money from his father to open a jazz record store called the 3D Record Mart on Detroit's east side, and watched it go bankrupt within 2 years because his customers wanted rhythm and blues, and he kept refusing to stock it. With 3 children to feed and no store left to run, he took a job on the Ford Motor Company assembly line, installing chrome trim on Lincoln Mercury vehicles, and spent his lunch breaks writing songs on scraps of paper because that was the only outlet he had left. What pulled him out of the factory was a chance introduction to a singer named Jackie Wilson through the Detroit music scene. Gordy started writing songs professionally in 1957, co-writing a track called Reet Petite with his sister Gwendolyn and a writer named Billy Davis, and Wilson recorded it and had a modest national hit with it. That experience taught Berry Gordy one lesson he never forgot. The royalty check a songwriter received was an insult compared to what the record label collected, and the only way to actually make money from music was to own every part of the process yourself. He needed money to make that happen, and he went to the one source he knew would not turn him away. The Gordy family operated a communal savings fund they called the Berry Co-op, a name built by combining their parents' names Bertha and Berry, and the fund existed so that family members could borrow from each other during hard times without going to banks that regularly refused loans to black families in 1950s Detroit. In January 1959, Berry Jr. stood in front of his family and asked to borrow $800 to start a record company. His oldest sister Esther pushed back hard on the idea, but the family voted and approved the loan, and on January 12, 1959, Tamla Records opened for business with Berry Jr.'s entire future riding on it. Hitsville USA, Later in 1959, Berry Gordy put $300 down on a two-story house at 2648 West Grand Boulevard in Detroit, a former photography studio that cost $23,000 in total. He moved his family into the upstairs living quarters and converted the ground floor into a recording studio and offices. He hung a sign on the outside that read Hitsville USA, and then set about proving the name accurate. The way he ran the label was borrowed directly from his years on the Ford assembly line. At Ford, the factory was divided into specialized stations where each worker performed one task before the product moved to the next station. Berry applied that same logic to making music. Songwriters worked in dedicated rooms. Musicians recorded in the basement studio that the session players nicknamed the Snake Pit because it was small and close and packed with cables and energy. A separate artist development department taught young performers how to carry themselves in public, how to handle interviews, how to sit at a dinner table and walk onto a stage so that no one watching could find a reason to dismiss them. Every Friday morning, Berry held what he called quality control meetings where new recordings were played for everyone in the building. Not just producers and executives, but secretaries and janitors too, and everyone voted on whether a record was good enough to release. His reasoning was simple. If a song could not move an ordinary person sitting in that room on a Friday morning, it was not going to move the public. The results came fast. In 1960, a record called Money, That's What I Want, that Berry co-wrote with Janie Bradford, became a genuine national hit. That same year, Smokey Robinson and the Miracles recorded Shop Around and sold over 1 million copies, giving Motown its first gold record. In 1961, the Marvelettes took Please Mr. Postman all the way to #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, which was Motown's first pop chart topper. Between 1961 and 1971, the label produced 110 top 10 Billboard hits. By 1966, Motown was bringing in $20 million a year in revenue and had been recognized by Black Enterprise as the largest Black-owned business in the entire country. The Gordy family was at the center of all of it. Sister Esther, the same woman who had pushed back on the $800 loan, became senior vice president and ran the artist management division with an authority that kept the business structure standing while Berry focused on the music. Sister Lucy became head of Joe B.T. Music Publishing and designed the financial tracking system that kept Motown solvent during its early years when cash was moving slowly and distributors were slow to pay. Sister Anna co-owned a smaller label called Anna Records alongside Sister Gwendolyn and a writer named Billy Davis, and that label distributed Motown's first national hit before being folded into the company in 1961. Sister Gwendolyn co-wrote early songs for Jackie Wilson alongside Berry and stayed connected to the creative work for years afterward. Berry Sr. himself eventually came in as a consultant and held an office in Motown's headquarters where young artists and established stars alike would come to sit with him when they needed someone older to talk to. Diana Ross, Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, and Smokey Robinson came together in 1978 to record a tribute song for him called Pops, We Love You, released as a commercial single that reached the top 20 on the R&B charts because the affection behind it was genuine. But behind that warmth and behind those achievements, the Gordy family was carrying losses that no chart position could reach. The grief the charts never showed. In the summer of 1965, Lucy Gordy Wakefield went to a Detroit hospital and did not come home. She was 41 years old. She died of a brain tumor while still holding her title as Vice President of Motown and head of Joe B.T. Music Publishing, the woman who had built the financial system that made the whole operation work. Motown was at the height of its power. The records kept coming, the charts kept moving, and Berry Gordy had just buried his sister. Motown released a gospel tribute album in her memory in 1968 called In Loving Memory, featuring Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, and Diana Ross and the Supremes. But no tribute album changes what it means to lose a sister at 41, while the empire she helped build keeps spinning without her. Sister Anna carried a different kind of grief, one that did not arrive all at once but built slowly across years and eventually across newspaper headlines. She married Marvin Gaye in 1963, and at the beginning, there was real love behind the relationship, with Marvin writing early songs that were shaped by his feelings for her. But Anna and Marvin had a private pain that stayed inside the family for years. She could not have biological children. So in 1966, they adopted a baby boy and presented him publicly as their biological son. The child's biological mother was Denise Gordy, Anna's own teenage niece, who had given birth just days after turning 16. The circumstances were kept quiet, and the question of paternity was never publicly resolved. And that silence sat inside the family for decades while the outside world watched Marvin Gaye become one of the most celebrated artists of his generation. The marriage fell apart through the early 1970s, and Marvin eventually left Anna for a younger woman named Janice Hunter. The divorce settlement that followed had a quality to it that only a Motown marriage could produce. Marvin agreed to hand over a portion of the royalties from his next album to Anna as part of the financial resolution, and that next album turned out to be a double record called Here My Dear, built almost entirely as a personal account of their marriage and its collapse. Anna received royalty money from an album about how painful it had been to be married to her. She listened to it play on the radio for years and said nothing publicly about it. Then, in April 1984, Anna received the call that Marvin Gaye had been shot and killed by his own father inside his parents' Los Angeles home, one day before his 45th birthday. Whatever complicated peace she had reached after the divorce was gone in an instant. She never remarried. She spent the remaining decades of her life making quiet appearances at events honoring Marvin's memory until she died on January 31, 2014, 3 days after her 92nd birthday, having outlived the man whose most famous album was addressed directly to her. The artists who left and the ones who were let go. What the public saw throughout the 1960s was a label that seemed impossible to compete with, and those numbers were real. In 1966 alone, 75% of every record Motown released made the national charts, a hit ratio no label before or since has matched over a full calendar year. But underneath those numbers was a control structure that Berry had built to protect the music and the artists, and that structure eventually began to push the people who built Motown's greatest records right out the door. Holland-Dozier-Holland were the songwriting and production team of Brian Holland, Lamont Dozier, and Edward Holland Jr., and they were responsible for dozens of Supreme's hits, Four Tops classics, and Martha and the Vandellas recordings that defined what Motown sounded like to the world. By 1967, they were pressing Berry for a share of company stock that he had promised Brian Holland and never delivered, so they walked out. They took their talent with them and triggered a round of lawsuits that Berry was fighting at the same time he was trying to keep the music going. The hole they left took years to fill, and it was the first sign that the family Berry had built inside the label was not going to hold together forever. In 1972, Berry relocated the entire Motown operation from Detroit to Los Angeles, a decision that severed the company from the city and the community that had given it everything. The Funk Brothers, the group of session musicians who had played on virtually every hit Motown ever recorded out of Studio A, found out the company had moved when they arrived at the building one morning and saw a note taped to the front door. They had never received royalties for their work, only flat session fees, and now the studio was empty and the people who paid those fees were 2,000 miles away. Then the stars began to go. Diana Ross left for RCA Records in 1981 after 2 decades as Motown's most visible face. Marvin Gaye signed with Columbia Records in 1982 after years of creative and financial tension with Berry over who controlled what. The Temptations left. Gladys Knight and the Pips left. The Jackson 5 had already gone years earlier, taking a teenage Michael Jackson to Epic Records where he became the best-selling recording artist in the world while his former label watched from across the country. Each departure did not just take an artist. It took a piece of what made Motown feel like Motown, and by the mid-1980s, what remained was a company struggling to stay on the charts in a music landscape that had moved forward and left it standing still. The sale that changed everything. By 1988, the financial pressure at Motown had become impossible to ignore. The artists who had defined the label were gone, and the new roster was not generating enough to sustain what Berry had built. In June of that year, he finally said yes to a deal with MCA Records and an investment group that valued the company at $61 million. He retained ownership of the Joe Bette music publishing catalog, but the label itself, the name, and the Hitsville legacy passed out of his hands and out of Black ownership permanently. The Black community felt it immediately. Motown had sat at the top of Black Enterprise magazine's annual ranking of the largest black-owned businesses in America every single year from 1973 to 1983, and losing it felt to many people like losing something that had belonged to everyone who had ever turned on a radio and heard a Motown record come through the speaker. Berry said publicly that he wanted to put the legacy in stronger hands and that running the company was no longer enjoyable, and those words were honest, but they did not make the loss feel any smaller to the people who had grown up with those records. Then 5 years later in 1993, MCA sold Motown to Polygram, a Dutch conglomerate, for $325 million. 5 times what Berry had accepted in 1988. That number became one of the most discussed figures in the history of Black American business because it showed in plain arithmetic what walking away from the table too early actually costs. Berry Gordy received nothing from that second sale because he had already signed his name on the first one. Smokey Robinson, who had been at Motown from the very beginning and stayed through the transition before eventually leaving in 1991, said afterward that after Berry sold the label it simply was not the same, and that he had felt a loyalty he wanted to honor, but eventually had to accept that what he was honoring no longer existed in the form he had always known it. What happened to the Gordy family after the sale is the most stunning part of this entire story, because losing the label turned out not to be the end of what they gave away. The real cost came later, and it came quietly. What the family left behind, and the reckoning. The Jobate music publishing catalog that Berry kept after the 1988 sale was the most valuable thing the Gordy family still held. It contained the rights to virtually every song recorded at Hitsville USA during Motown's greatest years, and radio stations, film studios, television networks, and advertisers were paying to use those songs every single year with no sign of stopping. The catalog was worth more than the label had sold for, and Berry knew it. In 1997, he sold half of Jobate to EMI Music Publishing for $132 million. In 2004, he sold the other half to EMI for $190 million. The music that the Gordy family had built from an $800 loan in 1959 had now passed entirely into the hands of a British corporation, piece by piece across 7 years. And the community in Detroit, where every one of those songs was created, received nothing from either transaction. Sister Esther Gordy Edwards had stayed behind in Detroit when the company moved to Los Angeles in 1972, and she spent the years that followed making sure the history did not disappear with it. When people started showing up at the old building on West Grand Boulevard wanting to see where the music happened, she let them in. In 1985, she turned that into something permanent and founded the Motown Historical Museum inside the original Hitsville building, preserving Studio A and the rooms and the story that the corporation had left behind when it moved to California. She understood that if the family did not hold the memory, then the memory would be gone. She died in 2011 at 91 years old, with the museum still open and a $75 million expansion project now underway to build out the full campus she had always imagined. Berry Jr.'s personal life across all of those years carried its own quiet weight of loss. 3 marriages, and all 3 ended in divorce. 8 children by 6 different women, some of those circumstances requiring years of public silence to protect the people involved. A son named Kennedy William Gordy, born in 1964, who grew up and became a recording artist under the name Rockwell, releasing a 1984 hit called Somebody's Watching Me that featured Michael Jackson on background vocals, which meant that Berry Gordy's own son was scoring a top 5 record on a competing label with the very artist Berry Gordy had let walk out of Hitsville years before. Motown today sits inside Universal Music Group, the largest music corporation in the world, operating out of Los Angeles. The building at 2648 West Grand Boulevard in Detroit still stands and is open to visitors who want to see Studio A and stand in the room where the music was made. Berry Gordy Jr. turned 95 years old on November 28, 2024, and is the last surviving member of his generation of the Gordy family. Every sibling who helped him turn that $800 loan into something the world still listens to is gone. The Gordy family came north from Georgia with nothing except the conviction that Berry Sr. had carried out of a state where his own ancestors had been enslaved, and they turned $800 into a music empire that changed American culture in ways that are still being felt today. But behind every hit record and every sold-out show was a family paying a price that never appeared on any balance sheet. Lucy died at 41 while the label she helped finance was in the middle of its greatest run and never got to see what it became. Anna spent decades as the woman whose ex-husband's most discussed album was written directly about her, and then received news of his death in the most devastating way imaginable, and spent the rest of her life carrying both of those things quietly. Berry Jr. lost 3 marriages and watched the company he built leave Detroit, leave black ownership, and leave the community where it started, piece by piece, year by year, until nothing was left in the family's hands. What Berry said when he sold Motown was that he wanted to protect the legacy. And that Esther stayed behind in Detroit to do was preserve the memory. Those are 2 different things, and the distance between them is where the real story of the Gordy family lives. Now drop your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Berry Gordy should have held on to Motown longer and waited for a stronger offer? Or was selling in 1988 the only realistic move left? And which member of the Gordy family do you believe sacrificed the most to build everything? We'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Global Status for more. You're going to enjoy it.